Good day, everyone. The topic for today's lesson is Evolution and Origin of Biodiversity 7.1 Evolution and Speciation Part 1 Patterns of Descent with Modification. So this lesson will show patterns of descent with modification to produce diversity. And by the end of this lesson, you are able now to define what a species is, describe the different types of reproductive isolating mechanisms and modes of speciation, and explain the impact of evolution to biodiversity. So let's first define what is a species. According to Mayer's practical definition and clear criteria, generally, a species is an evolutionary independent population or group of populations. For identification, the biological species concept was promoted by Ernst Mayr for a clear basis reproductive isolation. So Ernst Mayr class, for your information, was one of the 20th century's leading evolutionary biologists. He was also renowned taxonomist, tropical explorer, ornithologist, biologist who focuses mainly in studying birds, philosopher of biology, and historian of science. According to him, species are groups of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. Ibig sabihin, when you say interbreeding, they are capable of producing an offspring. Diba? Pero sabi dito, reproductively isolated from other such group. It means that kahit sabihin natin na maraming isda sa dagat, hindi porket isda sila lahat. Yan. Pwede sila basta-basta mag-interbreed from each other. So there are isolating mechanisms that prevents them to interbreed from each other. Before we continue to our next slide, let's watch first the biological species concept by Ernst Mayr.
The traditional species concept in taxonomy always has been the so-called typological species concept. A species is that which is different from another species. And then the word different, of course, always created difficulties, but the if in doubt, call it a species was sort of a feeling. But for many, many reasons, I and people that preceded me, like Carl Jordan, whom I mentioned of the Rothschild Museum, and Stresemann and Rentsch in Germany, and some Russian authors, had rejected the typological species concept for strictly scientific reasons. They said, as I put it in my more recent papers, if you want to find out what a species is, you have to ask what I call the Darwinian question. The question why? Why are there species? Why aren't all organisms able to, if they're at all similar to each other, to mate with each other and have offspring? Why is it all packaged in these separate units, species, and each of these packages is completely separated from the others and doesn't interbreed with it and doesn't mate with it? There must be some biological reason. And of course the reason, if you give it any thought, is very obvious. If an individual with one genotype mates with an individual of a very different genotype, then the offspring will be hybrids that are either inviable or sterile or certainly very much inferior, and that particular individual loses offspring. In other words, it is selected against. So the real meaning of the species, that's the way I now put it in my papers, is that it is a protection of well-balanced, harmonious genotypes against being destroyed through mating with others that are very different from it. And that's the basic species concept, and that is called the biological species concept. And it is a biological species is usually defined as a group of populations of a group of interbreeding populations, which is reproductively isolated, you call it genetically isolated from other such groups. And so that is the biological species concept.
We have now the mechanisms of reproductive isolation. When you say reproductive isolation is the presence of barriers. So may hindrance, may naghaharang. Barriers that hinders interbreeding of populations. First, we have the prezygotic barrier. It prevents mating or fertilization to occur. So, able silang mag-mate, but there are barriers that hinders them to mate although they are capable of mating. Yun yung prezygotic barrier. Now we have pozygotic barrier. So in here, pozygotic barrier or lowers the viability of the offspring. They are able now to mate. Sabihin natin nagkaroon silang mating. However, they cannot produce an offspring. Bakit kaya? So from this lesson, susunod na slide, ma-unleash natin yung mga reasons why they cannot produce an offspring. Yan, as you can see on the slide, we have two fishes. So the first one, in the upper part, an ancestral Prussian carp, and it's domesticated, yung sa below, descendant goldfish cannot mate with each other. So may reasons yan bakit hindi sila makapag-mate. Pag hindi sila makapag-mate, 'di ba? It prevents them to mate. Alam na this. Prezygotic kasi cannot mate eh. So there are 5 isolating mechanisms under prezygotic barrier. The first one is we have geographic, ecological, or habitat isolation. Next is temporal or seasonal isolation, behavioral isolation, mechanical isolation, and last is gametic isolation. We have 3 isolating mechanisms naman sa pozygotic barrier. So these are reduced hybrid viability, reduced hybrid fertility or hybrid sterility, hybrid breakdown, or viable fertile offspring. Now let us proceed to prezygotic reproductive isolating mechanism, geographic, ecological, or habitat isolation. Sabi, when two populations do not interbreed because they live in different habitats or lack by physical barriers, it is called habitat or ecological geographic isolation. Yan. Sabi dito, there are 2 salamanders population parted by the Central Valley in California. Although they are capable of mating each other, hindi sila makapag-mate kasi nga there is a physical barrier. Yan. So sabi dito, hiniwalay sila ng Central Valley in California. So dahil nga yun, isipin mo na lang, ikaw, tsaka yung, wag ikaw, bata ka pa, yung mag-asawa hindi mag-boyfriend-girlfriend, mag-asawa na foreigner, yan, hindi sila makapag-produce ng offspring kasi asawa niya nasa ibang bansa, OFW, yun. Ang physical barrier, dagat, usual. Buti nga na-invent pa si barko at saka si airplane para mag-meet. Yan. So, pasakayin na lang natin sa salamander. Okay, let's now proceed to another temporal or seasonal isolation. So, sabi, breeding at different times of the day or at different seasons and even years is a barrier for some species, even if they live in the same habitats and can successfully reproduce in the laboratory. So in the picture, we have in the upper part, in the top, make it drop, there's a web na hindi, American Todd on the top. Yan, meets in early summer, and Fowler's Todd bottom meets in late summer. So, yun nga, hindi sila magkapareha ng seasonal. 'Di ba nakikita mo may seasonal kung kailan nagbe-meow-meow ang mga Ang mga pusa, hindi naman lagi na wow! So, seasonal din. Hindi lagi. Yan. Grabe na yung lagi. So, yung breeding mechanism nila, magkiba ang oras. So, yun yung seasonal or temporal isolation. Although capable naman sila mag-produce, sabi nga dito, can successfully reproduce in the laboratory or nakatira sila sa same habitat, wala sila sa mood, 'di ba? Mag-reproduce. So, di ko mood ngayon. Mood ko autumn pa. Yung isa naman, spring na. Yeah. Okay, let's proceed to the next slide. We are finished already with seasonal. Next is behavior isolation. So, some behaviors such as courtship, panliligaw, rituals to attract mates are unique to a species for mate recognition, thus preventing other species or distant population from mixing. In insects, pheromones can signal and identify the same species. Tingnan mo, class, kita mo, kahit mere insect or any animals, lalo namang ibon, they have their courtship rituals, panliligaw. Kaya girls, tingnan mo, hayop na hayop, lower class animal, nagpapaligaw. So, kailangan mo din magpaligaw ha. Lalo mga lalaki, matuto kayo manligaw. Tingnan mo, daig pa kayo ng behavior ng mere insect or bird. Yung iba pa nga, pinapaghandaan niya ng bonggang-bongga. If you have the chance to have a glimpse in reproductive biology, makikita mo how fascinating the courtship rituals of different species. So, here in behavioral isolation, so yung insect daw, they have pheromones. Yung pheromones, it is a hormones that signals to identify that they are same of species. So, kaya hindi sila nagkakaroon ng mix-up. So, that is an isolating mechanism in behavioral isolation. Ito naman, we have the mechanical isolation. In some cases, mating was attempted but unsuccessful because the reproductive organs are incompatible. This is mechanical isolation. So, we have example, very large and very small dogs cannot naturally mate. Yan nga, 'di ba? Ang sakit sa puso. In love na in love ka. Kaso hindi pwede kasi nga magkaiba ang size. Nako, kung chihuahua man na lalaki, 'di ba? Na in love sa bulldog. Ay, nako. Hindi talaga pwede. Hindi compatible. So, kahit hagang love lang, wala nang mating yon. So, na-attempt man nila, but unsuccessful. Kasi nga, organs are incompatible. Next, we have the last one in prezygotic reproductive isolating mechanisms is the gametic isolations. And we have already studied the genes, di ba? During fertilization, embryo formation is facilitated by many proteins for signaling and binding. It may fail if the gametes are incompatible and not recognized by the proteins. Gametic isolation limits the creation of hybrids. For those who do not know, class, for information, a coral is composed of thousands of tiny animals called polyps. They are fascinating animal that forms reefs that provides food and habitat for about 25%. Now, you know, di ba, na ang ating corals pala ay animal and they are able to produce gametes which are the sex cells. Now we are done with pre-zygotic reproductive isolating mechanisms. Let's go to post-zygotic reproductive isolating mechanisms. So number one, we have reduced hybrid viability. If fertilization does proceed, there are still some barriers that reduce the viability of the embryos. Closely related species can mate, nagmi-mate na sila to produce a hybrid that does not develop and dies an embryo. So, Sabihin natin, after ng mating, nakaproduce sila ng hybrid. But for some time, that embryo cannot develop. They will still remain as embryo lang. Next is we have reduced hybrid fertility or hybrid sterility. If the parents do not have the same chromosome number, a hybrid offspring may develop into maturity but can no longer reproduce, ending up infertile. So, meron kaming tanungan yan during dialogue with na scientist. He is a scientist that focuses on carabaos. So, sabi ng isa naming classmate, possible po ba ang tama raw natin na magkaroon ng crossbreed, makaproduce ng hybrid, if yung ipapag-crossbreed niya is yung carabao galing sa ibang bansa para mas malaki? Sabi ng scientist, possible, but usually unsuccessful yun kasi they have different number of chromosomes. So, dito naman, nakaproduce man sila ng successful man yung hybrid nila as offspring, but that kind of hybrid cannot reproduce another because it is infertile. So lastly, we have hybrid breakdown or viable fertile offspring. Hybrid fertile organisms might still produce sterile offspring, which in that case is a hybrid breakdown. Still, there are some rare fertile hybrids in the wild that can be treated as a species or subspecies. So when you say hybrid breakdown, it is a type of reproductive failure that appears after F2 generation of crosses between the different species or subspecies. It is caused by incompatibility between interacting genes. For example, a sterile mule produced from mating of horse and donkey, or let's say tigon from mating lion and tiger. This results in mating of two F1 fertile offspring resulting in sterile F2 generation offspring. This results in loss of fecundity and makes them unfit for establishing population.
Many people have an idea of what a species is, but it's actually quite hard to get a concrete definition for it. What defines a species? Is it how similar a group of organisms looks? Is it the similarity of their DNA? There are a lot of concepts of what a species is out there, but most scientists go by the biological species concept. This states that a species is a group of populations with individuals that can successfully mate with each other, producing viable and fertile offspring. Let's take a horse and a donkey. You wouldn't say that they're part of the same species, because even though they can successfully breed and produce a mule, the mule is sterile, meaning that it can't reproduce. This is a reproductive barrier called reduced hybrid fertility, since, well, the offspring aren't fertile. Let's take a closer look at the different reproductive barriers. So we've got the prezygotic barriers over here, meaning pre-zygote or before a zygote forms. Prezygotic barriers prevent successful mating from even occurring. One type is called habitat isolation, which is when species live in different habitats and may encounter each other rarely, if at all. If they can't get to each other, they can't mate. Another one is called temporal isolation, and this is when species breed during different times. A flower may have a different time of pollination than another one, so the two different flowers can't mate. Third of all, behavioral isolation is when courtship rituals or other animal behavior prevent fertilization, like this failed mating dance. Yikes. Anyways, here's an example of mechanical isolation, which is when morphological differences between organisms prevent successful fertilization. These two snails have different spiral directions, so their genital openings are not aligned. Finally, there's gametic isolation, which is when sperm of one species are unable to fertilize the eggs of another species, simply because of biochemical mechanisms, pH, or other variables. We've also got 3 postzygotic barriers, or postzygote, meaning after the zygote forms. We already talked about the horse and the donkey, and that's an example of reduced hybrid fertility. Reduced hybrid viability is seen when offspring are in fact produced, but the development or survival of the offspring is hindered due to genetic factors. Last of all is hybrid breakdown, which means that the first generation of offspring is viable and fertile, but when these first generation progeny are mated with each other, they don't produce offspring successfully. So basically, each generation of hybrids is just breaking down slowly until fertilization can't occur successfully anymore. And now you know what a species is and the barriers that can be present when mating different species. That's all I've got for the biological species concept, and check out my other AP Biology videos. Thanks for watching!
Speciation is a form of evolution wherein one species gives rise to another species. Two organisms belong to the same species if they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. If organisms do not satisfy these two conditions, they are considered to be of different species. Organisms belonging to the same species can look very different from each other, but till the time they can successfully interbreed and give fertile offsprings, they are considered to be of the same species. Speciation can occur in four ways: allopatric, sympatric, peripatric, and parapatric speciation. Consider a species of snails living together happily. Due to geographical isolation, the population gets divided. Each divided population evolves separately. After a time period, they cannot reproduce together, meaning they have evolved into two separate species. This type of speciation due to geographical isolation is called as allopatric speciation. Peripatric speciation is similar to allopatric speciation, wherein the geographical isolation occurs at the periphery, isolating a small population. This small population evolves separately from the parent population, and over a period of time, two separate species are formed that cannot mate with each other. From the word peripatric, we can remember that speciation is occurring at the periphery. The geographical barriers in the allopatric and peripatric speciation can either be a river, an ocean, mountain, valley, etc. In a large population, random genetic differences can arise in a small population, leading to altered preferences or behavior. The new population evolves within the same area, leading to the generation of a separate species which can no longer interbreed with the parent species. This type of speciation, wherein two species evolve together without any geographical isolation, is called as sympatric speciation. When the surrounding area or the niche of the population changes due to factors like pollution, it leads to the generation of two niches, one original niche and a second new niche which is formed due to pollution. The species in the new niche undergoes random genetic differences to adjust to the polluted environment. Partial spatial isolation leads to parapatric speciation, that is, the snail in the clean and polluted area become two distinct species over a period of time. However, the two species are connected through a hybrid zone. Parapatric speciation is slightly different from sympatric speciation because the evolution of the new species takes place in a separate niche, and in sympatric speciation, the evolution of both the new species occurs together. A similar effect is seen with a population around a large water body wherein continued differences in the species is observed due to the presence of garbage at one end. In case of allopatric and peripatric speciation, geographical isolation leads to genetic isolation. However, in case of sympatric and parapatric speciation, genetic isolation leads to geographical isolation. We can also say that this is due to the ecological isolation, as the genetic differences changes the ecological behavior of the organism. Also, we must note that peripatric and parapatric speciation both occurs in a small niche. To summarize it, allopatric speciation occurs due to geographical isolation, and both the species evolve separately. Peripatric speciation is like allopatric speciation occurring at a small level, where the geographical barriers separate the two species at the periphery and evolution occurs separately. In parapatric speciation, due to ecological changes, genetic differences occur leading to speciation. The evolution takes place in the adjacent niche. In sympatric speciation, ecological differences or random genetic differences takes place in a small population, which then reproduces and evolve within the same population or the same niche as that of the parent population.